The DOJ's ruling didn't land quietly. It slammed into Washington like a steel door snapping shut, and the first person to respond wasn't a Republican committee chair or a legal expert on cable news. It was Zohran Mamdani, furious, unfiltered, and ready to make the ruling itself the centerpiece of a political fight that is now impossible to ignore. From the moment he stepped in front of the cameras, you could see the tension in his posture. This wasn't frustration. This was genuine anger, the kind that comes when months of organizing, planning, and momentum get wiped out with a single federal decision. For Mamdani, the DOJ didn't just reject a policy idea. They undermined an entire vision he has been pushing with relentless energy. That vision was ambitious, disruptive, and intentionally provocative. It centered on rethinking enforcement structures, decentralizing power, and shifting authority away from the traditional federal model toward a more community-driven framework. It was the kind of policy that supporters saw as transformational and opponents viewed as reckless. Today, the DOJ chose a side. Their ruling wasn't vague. It wasn't cautious. It didn't leave room for interpretation. It was firm, decisive, and rooted in legal language that left almost no path forward for the proposal as written. And Mamdani immediately recognized the implication. The door on his initiative wasn't closing. It was locked. But here's where the story escalates. House Republicans didn't wait for reporters to digest the ruling. They pounced in seconds. Within moments of Mamdani's statement, multiple Republican members emerged with their own reactions, confident, almost celebratory in tone. They framed the ruling as a necessary correction, a constitutional safeguard, and in some cases, a slap down of what they describe as a fringe ideology infiltrating federal policymaking. Their message was coordinated and aggressive. To them, this was the win they had been hoping for, a legal validation that allowed them to argue that Mamdani's push was not merely misguided, but unlawful. And the contrast between both sides was striking. Mamdani arguing the DOJ was weaponizing federal authority. Republicans claiming the DOJ was finally stepping in to restore federal boundaries. Two completely different interpretations of the same decision. This wasn't a policy debate anymore. This was a collision of political identities. But to understand the intensity of Mamdani's reaction, you have to understand what was actually at stake. His proposal wasn't a fringe bill buried in committees. It had traction. It had organizers behind it. It had messaging power. It had gained attention in activist circles, academic spaces, and even some corners of state and federal offices. It wasn't mainstream, but it wasn't irrelevant either. This was the moment when the proposal was beginning to shift from idea to possibility. The DOJ made sure it stayed an idea. Mamdani's frustration was rooted in more than policy. It was rooted in momentum that evaporated in an instant. And when momentum disappears, political opportunity disappears with it. That's why he came out swinging. He accused the DOJ of suppressing progress, stifling change, and defending entrenched power structures. He framed the ruling not as a legal interpretation, but as a political interference meant to shut down transformative ideas before they gain enough traction to become unstoppable. That framing resonated immediately within certain circles. Activists began mobilizing. Progressive organizations demanded clarification. Legal analysts on social media called for transparency. The DOJ ruling was no longer a document. It was a spark. And while all of this was unfolding, Elon Musk became part of the story without even trying. Musk didn't need a long thread. He didn't need a televised interview. He didn't need to take an explicit position. His engagement alone, a comment, a signal, a simple reaction, pushed the conversation into a far larger arena than it would have reached on its own. Millions who normally wouldn't track House disputes or DOJ actions suddenly became aware of the ruling, the conflict, and Mamdani's anger. Musk's involvement didn't shape the legal debate, but it shaped the visibility of the moment. And visibility is power. That amplification changed the stakes. It meant the fight was no longer just between Mamdani and House Republicans. It meant the ruling wasn't just a procedural step. It meant the political cost of mismanaging the narrative grew instantly. That's when the tension intensified. Republicans escalated their messaging. They argued that Musk's amplification only highlighted how dangerous the proposal had been. They claimed the ruling protected everyday Americans from radical experimentation. They portrayed Mamdani as a threat to institutional stability. Democrats, meanwhile, were caught in the crossfire, forced to react without choosing a side too quickly. Some quietly defended the DOJ's right to interpret the law. Others urged caution and called for more transparency. A few aligned with Mamdani's criticism, especially those who view federal agencies with suspicion. In other words, the ruling didn't just divide parties. It divided Democrats internally, creating another layer of tension. But here's the most important takeaway. This was not a small ruling. This was a message. A very direct, very clear message that the DOJ is not willing to entertain structural experiments that push beyond certain boundaries. And the moment that message went public, it triggered a political chain reaction that's now engulfing Congress, activists, donors, media figures, and public commentators. Mamdani's fury wasn't overreaction. It was recognition. Recognition that the DOJ decision didn't end a policy fight. It started a political war. And Mamdani knows exactly what that means. It means Republicans will keep pressing the advantage. It means moderates will distance themselves. It means activists will demand escalation. It means the next steps matter more than the ruling itself. Now the story shifts. Does Mamdani turn this into a national movement? Does he challenge the DOJ directly? Does he rebuild the policy into a new form? Or does he risk losing the narrative to opponents who are already shaping it in real time? Every option carries consequences. Every option carries opportunities. And every option puts him on a path that determines whether this ruling becomes a temporary setback or a defining moment in his political career. The ruling itself is done. What happens next is the real fight. The moment the DOJ ruling hit the wires, the political machinery behind the scenes snapped into motion. What the public saw, Mamdani's anger, Republican celebration, online arguments, was only the surface. Underneath, a far more complex and calculated series of moves began unfolding in real time. Because in Washington, no one waits for the dust to settle. They start shaping the dust. For Mamdani, damage control wasn't the priority. Framing the narrative was. Before the ruling, he had been pushing a policy built on bold systemic changes. After the ruling, his mission shifted instantly. Make the DOJ look like the aggressor, not him. That meant mobilizing the people who supported his proposal, activists, academic voices, policy coalitions, to set the tone before Republicans cemented their version of the story. His team understood the stakes immediately. If Republicans define the narrative first, the ruling becomes a referendum on him. If Mamdani defines it first, the ruling becomes a referendum on federal power. That's the game now. Within hours, his advisors were drafting talking points, reaching out to sympathetic media, and preparing a series of public statements designed to turn the ruling into an example of federal overreach. Their message was clear. This wasn't just a policy rejection, it was a political crackdown, and Mamdani planned to lean into that hard. But while his team worked to mobilize support, House Republicans were already executing a strategy of their own. Their goal wasn't just to praise the ruling. Their goal was to make Mamdani the symbol of a broader ideological threat. They understood something critical. If they can portray Mamdani's proposal as dangerously radical, they can use the ruling to reinforce their argument that the progressive wing is pushing the country toward instability. So they coordinated their messaging across committees, press offices, and conservative media outlets. They emphasized legality. They emphasized constitutional overreach. They emphasized the idea that this ruling wasn't about Mamdani. It was about protecting the country. On cable news, the language became sharper. On social media, the tone became bolder. And inside congressional offices, Republicans were preparing follow-up actions, hearings, document requests, and resolutions intended to keep the spotlight on Mamdani's proposal, even though the DOJ had already blocked it. That's the political play. Don't let the moment fade. Sustain the pressure until it becomes an advantage. While both sides were escalating, Democrats were split, and that division added another layer of complexity to the strategy calculations. Moderate Democrats didn't want to be dragged into a high-profile conflict. Some of them had quietly distanced themselves even before the ruling. To them, Mamdani's proposal was too risky, too controversial, and too likely to paint the party as extreme in swing districts. Progressives, on the other hand, saw the ruling as proof of what they've been arguing for years, that federal institutions are too aligned with status quo interests and too quick to shut down transformative ideas. Privately, some progressive members encouraged Mamdani to turn this into a national fight. Publicly, they treaded carefully, waiting to see where public opinion moved. Strategically, they were calculating whether this moment could elevate their influence inside the party. The split within the Democratic caucus created two problems for Mamdani. He couldn't rely on full party support. He couldn't let Republicans define him uncontested. That meant he needed external momentum, the kind of momentum that doesn't come from politicians, but from public energy. And that's where Elon Musk's unintended influence became a strategic variable. When Musk reacted to the ruling, subtly but visibly, it amplified the entire situation. His audience isn't small, and it isn't passive. His engagement turned the story from a political dispute into a national conversation. Musk didn't take a side. He didn't need to. Just drawing attention elevated the stakes. Mamdani's advisors recognized the opportunity immediately. The wider the audience, the more effective their reframing strategy could be. The more eyes on the story, the easier it became to argue that this ruling wasn't just about one lawmaker's proposal. It was about federal control versus community control. Republicans recognized the risk too. That's why they doubled down on messaging that painted the ruling as a constitutional correction, not an ideological suppression. Everyone was playing chess, fast. But there was another layer unfolding in private. Democratic leadership was uneasy. They weren't worried about Mamdani losing a fight. They were worried about the fight itself. A high-profile conflict involving the DOJ, a progressive legislator, House Republicans, and Elon Musk is the kind of political fire that spreads in unpredictable directions. It risks drawing attention to fractures within the party. It risks distracting from broader messaging. And it risks forcing other Democrats to take positions they don't want to take. Behind closed doors, leadership held quiet conversations about controlling the fallout. Not because they opposed Mamdani's ideas, but because the optics could spiral. Some suggested that Mamdani should de-escalate. Others suggested creating distance from the ruling. A few suggested ignoring the entire conflict publicly. But Mamdani wasn't going to back down, and his supporters wouldn't allow it. To them, this was about principle. To them, backing down wasn't an option. To them, the ruling was part of a larger pattern of federal resistance to grassroots ideas. And so, a strategic decision was made: lean in, turn the ruling into a symbol, make the conflict bigger, not smaller, force the country to debate the underlying ideas, not just the legal language. That is Mamdani's next move. His team began outlining the steps. Prepare a national speech reframing the issue. Launch a public campaign challenging the DOJ's reasoning. Mobilize activist groups for large-scale demonstrations. Work with legal analysts to question the framework of the ruling. Pressure Democratic leadership to take a position. Expand the conversation beyond the original policy proposal. Transform the ruling into a rallying issue for his broader agenda. This is how political losses are turned into political weapons. And Republicans see it coming, which is why they're preparing countermeasures, including hearings and public investigations designed to keep Mamdani on the defensive. The DOJ ruling may have ended the policy. It did not end the fight. It started a much bigger one. The political fight that exploded after the DOJ ruling wasn't limited to press conferences and social media reactions. It immediately shifted into the next stage, the phase where strategy replaces emotion, where every faction begins positioning itself for advantage, and where the consequences of the ruling start shaping the national landscape. Because what happens after a major federal decision isn't reaction, it's repositioning. And Republicans moved first. Inside key House offices, senior members began outlining a plan to turn the ruling into a long-term narrative weapon. They weren't satisfied with winning the legal point. They wanted to define the political meaning of it. They wanted Mamdani, and anyone pushing ideas like his, to become a symbol of what they call the radical policy frontier. Their strategy had 3 prongs. First, sustain the pressure. Hearings, oversight letters, public investigations. Not because they expect to uncover wrongdoing, but because investigations extend the life of a controversy far beyond its natural expiration date. Second, control the framing. They're pushing the message that this ruling shows federal institutions still have guardrails, that Mamdani's ideas cross those guardrails, and that the country should be relieved the DOJ stepped in. Third, divide Democrats. If they can force moderate Democrats to distance themselves from Mamdani and progressives to rally around him, the internal split becomes visible. And visible division is political leverage. So while Republicans prepared to weaponize the ruling, Mamdani's camp was planning something just as ambitious, a full counteroffensive. Mamdani knows he can't win this fight by playing defensively. He can't let Republicans define him. He can't rely on Democratic leadership to protect him. And he can't allow the ruling to be seen as proof that his ideas were out of bounds. His strategy revolves around flipping the meaning of the ruling. Instead of letting it stand as a rejection, he wants it seen as evidence of federal resistance to necessary change. Instead of allowing Republicans to call it a victory, he wants supporters to see it as a call to action. And instead of accepting the boundary the DOJ set, he wants to argue that the boundary itself is outdated. His advisors are pushing him to escalate, not retreat. One plan on the table: use the ruling to launch a national campaign about federal overreach and democratic accountability. Another: hold a major public address framing the fight as a struggle between rigid institutions and modern communities that want autonomy. A third: mobilize activists in targeted states to pressure their representatives into taking a stance on the ruling. This isn't about reviving the original proposal. It's about growing the movement behind it. But Mamdani's challenge isn't just crafting a compelling message. It's navigating the fractured political terrain around him. Progressive organizations are energized. They see the ruling as proof of everything they've been warning about, that federal agencies remain aligned with outdated frameworks and resistant to bottom-up change. Some groups want immediate action, protests, public letters, large-scale mobilization. Others prefer a phased strategy: build momentum, gather support, create sustained public pressure. But they all agree on one point: backing down would be fatal. For the progressive wing, this ruling isn't an endpoint. It's the beginning of a broader push. Meanwhile, moderates inside the Democratic Party are growing anxious. They don't want a party-wide fight over a controversial policy. They don't want to be forced to take sides. And they don't want to add fuel to Republican attacks that Democrats are divided and out of alignment. So they're trying to quietly discourage escalation. They're urging caution. They're advising patience. But Mamdani doesn't have the luxury of patience. Not after going public with his fury. Not after becoming the central figure of this clash. Not after the story went national. And certainly not after Elon Musk amplified the moment to millions of viewers across the political spectrum. Because Musk's involvement, even without a strong opinion, changed the power dynamics. His audience includes people who distrust institutions, people who oppose federal overreach, and people who want transparency at every level of government. When Musk highlighted the ruling, he turned it into a test of whether the DOJ is operating fairly or protectively. Musk's presence added credibility to the idea that this ruling deserves more scrutiny. Republicans noticed. Progressives noticed. Mamdani noticed. And that's why the political landscape is shifting into something far bigger than a dispute over one proposal. Strategists from both parties are already running simulations. How does this ruling play with suburban voters? Does it shift perceptions of federal authority? Does it energize certain demographics? Does it draw new attention to the progressive movement? Does it make moderates nervous? More importantly, does this become a wedge issue in the next election cycle? Some Republicans think it will. They're preparing messaging that positions the ruling as a victory against political extremism, even though they know Mamdani isn't a national figure. Their goal isn't to attack him personally. Their goal is to attach his ideas to the broader progressive brand. If they can do that, they gain an advantage in battleground districts. Democrats are aware of this, and it's forcing uncomfortable conversations inside the party. Some leaders quietly argue that Mamdani should lower the temperature for the sake of party unity. Others think abandoning him now would look weak and embolden Republicans. A few believe the conflict is inevitable, and the best option is to lean into it strategically. But the most important question remains: what happens next? On the surface, the ruling is final. But in politics, the law is only part of the battlefield. Narrative is the other half. And right now, the narrative is still fluid. Mamdani's next move will determine its direction. If he escalates too aggressively, he risks alienating moderates. If he softens too much, he loses the progressives who are ready to fight. If he does nothing, Republicans paint him as defeated and irrelevant. So his strategy needs precision. That precision is what his team is working on behind the scenes, building a plan that turns a legal loss into a political catalyst. They're analyzing polling data. They're prepping talking points. They're coordinating with activist groups. They're studying how similar rulings have played out historically. They're examining how public sentiment shifts when federal agencies appear overly aggressive. Every move from this point forward is calculated. Every word is chosen with intention. Every appearance is crafted to shift the narrative another inch. Because Mamdani isn't just fighting a ruling. He's fighting for the future of his political identity. And this battle, whether he wins or loses, will define him for years to come. Part 4 will take you into the next phase: the fallout, the high-stakes messaging war, the party fractures, and the emerging power dynamics that could reshape both sides. The political fallout from the DOJ ruling didn't fade after the initial shock. It deepened, it widened, and it began reshaping the internal balance of power in ways that neither side fully anticipated. Because once the dust settled, something became clear. This wasn't just a fight about one policy or one lawmaker. It had become a prism, revealing fractures, exposing agendas, and forcing everyone in Washington to reconsider their next move. Republicans saw the ruling as a momentum shift. Progressives saw it as a warning sign. Moderates saw it as a liability. And Mamdani? He saw it as an inflection point. The first visible crack appeared inside the Democratic caucus. Some members who had previously stayed neutral began signaling discomfort, not publicly, but in private conversations, strategy calls, and quiet text chains that circulate within Capitol Hill circles. Their concern wasn't ideological. It was strategic. They worried that the conflict was starting to overshadow legislative priorities, giving Republicans a narrative advantage right when the party was attempting to project unity. They worried that Mamdani's refusal to back down would force them into uncomfortable positions. And they worried that progressives were treating the ruling as a rallying cry rather than a setback. But progressives had already made up their minds. For them, the ruling wasn't a moment to retreat. It was a moment to escalate. Grassroots organizations began coordinating messaging campaigns targeting the DOJ directly. Activist groups launched calls for public demonstrations demanding transparency. Policy advocates drafted letters challenging the legal justification of the ruling. Online networks, particularly younger and more energized factions, treated the ruling as evidence of systemic resistance to transformative ideas. This wasn't an organized movement yet, but it was a rapidly forming one, and Mamdani sat at the center of it. His inbox filled with offers of support. His public statements were amplified across activist platforms. His fundraising numbers began climbing, not dramatically, but noticeably. Momentum was shifting, but not in a way that unified the party. It was dividing it. Meanwhile, Republicans were thrilled. They understood the political value of internal democratic fractures. They understood the optics of a DOJ ruling splitting a party's ideological wings. And they understood that Mamdani's growing visibility would allow them to paint progressivism as chaotic and destabilizing. So they continued to build on the opportunity. Republican committee chairs drafted letters requesting internal DOJ communications related to the ruling. Strategists began crafting messaging for midterm campaigns that tied Mamdani's agenda to broader concerns about federal authority. Conservative media framed the clash as a wake-up call about what they call fringe policy extremism. And in interviews, several GOP members began describing Mamdani by name, something they rarely did before the ruling. That alone signaled his rise in visibility. And visibility cuts both ways. Inside Democratic leadership circles, the mood shifted from concern to calculation. They knew they had to address the fracture before it grew into a full factional divide. So back-channel conversations began. Some leaders reached out to Mamdani privately, urging him to take a measured approach. Others reached out to moderates, encouraging them not to overreact. A select few attempted to quietly communicate with progressive organizers, asking for restraint in their public messaging. But none of these groups trusted each other enough to stand down. Progressives felt the ruling revealed systemic bias. Moderates feared the ruling exposed the party's vulnerabilities. Leadership wanted everyone to stop talking, and Mamdani refused to step out of the spotlight. Because for him, this fight had already become bigger than the proposal that DOJ rejected. It had become a test of how far federal agencies could go in blocking transformative policy ideas. A test of whether lawmakers with bold agendas would be silenced before their ideas reached the public. A test of whether political institutions were willing to let democracy push beyond its comfort zone. That framing resonated deeply with his supporters. To them, backing down now would send the message that federal pressure works. Staying vocal signaled that political courage still exists. Meanwhile, Elon Musk's continuing engagement ensured the controversy didn't fade from public view. Each comment, each signal boost, each reaction kept the conversation alive, not necessarily because Musk supported Mamdani's ideas, but because he amplified the underlying question of federal transparency. And in modern politics, amplification is influence. His involvement kept the ruling in national circulation, drawing attention from audiences who would never otherwise follow DOJ decisions or intra-party dynamics. That visibility pushed the conflict into a new phase, one where the stakes expanded from political positioning to national perception. Republicans used that perception to argue that the ruling was necessary. Progressives used it to argue the ruling was unjust. Moderates tried to avoid being pulled into either narrative. Leadership tried to quietly contain the fallout. But the reality was undeniable. The DOJ ruling had triggered a political chain reaction that no one could fully control. And now, the country was watching. The immediate question wasn't whether Mamdani would continue fighting. He already made that clear. The question was whether this moment would become a turning point. A moment that redefined the coalition around him, realigned political forces, and reshaped the internal identity of the Democratic Party itself. Because sometimes a single ruling doesn't just shut down a proposal. It exposes the fractures that were already there. It forces factions into the open. It reveals how fragile political alliances truly are.